spent $90,000 on her dream cake, but she forgot I was her mother. At 53, I believed I had mastered the delicate architecture of love and sacrifice. My career as a successful architect had taught me that every foundation must be solid, every support beam carefully placed, and every detail meticulously planned. But nothing in my professional experience had prepared me for the moment my own daughter would demolish everything I had built for her with a single, devastating sentence. "We wanted it simple, just his family listed." Have you ever felt the ground shift beneath your feet while you're standing perfectly still? That's exactly what happened when I held that wedding invitation in my trembling hands, staring at the elegant calligraphy that had somehow erased 28 years of my existence. But here's what they didn't know about architects. We don't just build, we also know exactly how to bring things down. And when my daughter Isabella screamed into the phone the day before her wedding, "Mom, the baker won't release the cake you paid for," I responded with the calm precision of someone who had been planning this moment for weeks. "Keep it simple then." Welcome to the story of how a seven-tier architectural marvel of sugar, French buttercream, and hand-sculpted sugar roses became the sweetest weapon of divine retribution ever created. This isn't just about a wedding cake. This is about watching the daughter you sacrificed everything for transform into a stranger who sees your love as a liability. This is about discovering that the child you raised to value authenticity has become a master of social manipulation. And this is about the moment when a mother's unconditional love meets its breaking point and transforms into something far more dangerous: calculated justice. The explosion didn't happen with fireworks and drama. It happened with the quiet, bone-chilling click of a master baker's walk-in cooler door shutting for the final time, sealing away not just a cake, but the last remnants of a relationship that had been slowly poisoned by ambition and shame. My name is Catherine, and for 28 years, my daughter Isabella was the sun around which my entire universe revolved. When my husband Benjamin died suddenly from a massive stroke when Isabella was only 11 years old, it felt like half of my soul had been ripped away. But I had a daughter to raise, a promise to keep, and a future to build from the ashes of our shattered family. I threw myself into my work with the desperate intensity of a woman who knew that every blueprint I designed, every building I created, every client I impressed was another brick in the fortress I was building around my daughter's future. Architecture wasn't just my profession, it became my weapon against a world that had already taken too much from us. I worked 18-hour days, not because I loved the work, though I did, but because every additional project meant another deposit in Isabella's college fund, another opportunity for her to have choices I never had. The house I designed for us wasn't just a home. It was a love letter written in steel, glass, and stone. Every room was crafted with Isabella's personality in mind. The library with floor-to-ceiling windows where she could read for hours, bathed in natural light. The art studio where she could paint and dream. The kitchen with the oversized island where we shared thousands of meals and even more conversations. I didn't just want to give her shelter. I wanted to give her a sanctuary where she would always know she was cherished, valued, and deeply loved. Isabella was extraordinary. Brilliant, compassionate, and fiercely independent. She had her father's quick wit and his ability to see the best in everyone. She was the kind of person who remembered the names of every barista, who stopped to help injured animals, who could make friends with anyone within minutes of meeting them. Watching her grow up was like watching a masterpiece being painted, each year revealing new depths, new colors, new dimensions of the incredible human being she was becoming. When she left for Princeton, I was devastated but proud. I had raised a daughter who was confident enough to take on the world, smart enough to succeed anywhere, and grounded enough to remember where she came from. Or so I thought. It was during her junior year that she met Nathaniel Worthington. The Worthingtons aren't just wealthy, they are American royalty. Their money is so old it predates the Industrial Revolution. They don't have jobs, they have interests. They don't live in houses, they maintain properties. Their family crest is older than most countries, and their influence extends into every corner of high society, politics, and old money culture. Nathaniel was everything I might have designed if I were creating the perfect boyfriend for my daughter. Handsome in that effortless way that comes from generations of good breeding, intelligent without being arrogant, charming without being manipulative. When Isabella first brought him home for Christmas, I was genuinely delighted. He was respectful, engaged in real conversations with me about architecture and art, and most importantly, he seemed to absolutely adore my daughter. But then something began to shift, so gradually that I almost missed it. Isabella started using different words, developing different interests, expressing different opinions. She began talking about summering in the Hamptons and wintering in Aspen. She developed a sudden fascination with equestrian sports, despite having been afraid of horses her entire life. She started critiquing things that had never bothered her before. The first time she suggested that our home was a bit too contemporary for her taste, I brushed it off as college-aged rebellion. When she mentioned that the Worthingtons preferred more traditional architectural styles, I assumed she was just trying to impress her boyfriend's family. But when she started referring to my successful architectural firm as Mom's little design hobby, I felt the first crack in the foundation of our relationship. The changes weren't just superficial. Isabella was rewriting our entire family history to fit into the Worthington narrative. My late husband, a brilliant and beloved high school principal who had touched hundreds of young lives, became someone who worked in education. My architectural career, which had earned numerous awards and allowed us to live comfortably in one of the city's most prestigious neighborhoods, became dabbling in interior design. Our family's story of resilience, hard work, and love was being sanded down and smoothed over until it fit perfectly into their predetermined mold. I told myself it was temporary. Young people often lose themselves a bit when they fall in love, especially when that love comes with such a dramatically different world attached to it. I convinced myself that once the novelty wore off, my independent, authentic daughter would reassert herself. I was wrong. When Nathaniel proposed during her senior year, with a ring that had been in his family for 6 generations and was worth more than most people's houses, I was thrilled for her. Despite my growing concerns about the changes in her personality, I could see that she loved him deeply, and he seemed to love her just as much. Love, I believed, would be enough to navigate whatever social pressures they might face. The wedding planning began immediately, and it became clear that this wasn't going to be a wedding. It was going to be a social event of historic proportions. The Worthingtons had agreed to host the ceremony and reception at their family estate, a sprawling property in the Hudson Valley that had been in their family for over 2 centuries. The guest list read like a who's who of American high society, old money, and political influence. My role in this production was carefully defined and strictly limited. I was to be the silent financial partner, contributing generously while remaining largely invisible. The logic was explained to me with the kind of patient condescension usually reserved for small children. The Worthingtons were hosting, so naturally, they would handle all the planning and coordination. My job was simply to write checks when requested and to show up looking appropriately grateful for the privilege of being included. The wedding cake became my particular responsibility, and it was here that the true scope of their ambitions became clear. Isabella and the formidable Mrs. Worthington had decided that only a creation by Celeste Dubois would be worthy of this occasion. Celeste wasn't just a baker, she was a culinary artist whose cakes were edible sculptures that appeared in museums as often as they did at weddings. Her waiting list was legendary, stretching out nearly 4 years, and securing her services was considered a mark of ultimate social achievement. Getting Celeste to agree to create Isabella's wedding cake was a months-long campaign that required every professional connection I had ever made. I finally succeeded through a client who was a serious collector of Celeste's work and had significant influence in the art world. The meeting with Celeste herself was extraordinary. She was a fellow self-made woman who had built her reputation through pure talent and relentless perfectionism. We connected immediately over our shared experiences of succeeding in male-dominated fields. The contract I signed was as complex and detailed as any architectural agreement I had ever seen. It specified not just the design and delivery details, but also the artistic integrity clauses, the exclusivity agreements, and the payment schedule. The initial deposit alone was staggering, $35,000, with the total cost reaching nearly $90,000 for what Celeste promised would be her masterpiece. The contract was exclusively between Catherine Miller Architecture and Celeste Dubois Culinary Arts. Isabella's name appeared nowhere on the document. Nathaniel's name was absent. The Worthington family name was completely omitted. At the time, this seemed like a mere technicality. 6 weeks before the wedding, the invitations arrived. They were works of art in themselves, thick, hand-pressed paper with engravings so deep you could feel the letters with your fingertips. The calligraphy was museum quality, and the overall effect was breathtaking in its elegance and formality. The invitation announced the union of Isabella Catherine Hayes and Nathaniel Benjamin Worthington IV, and at the bottom, in script so beautiful it looked like poetry, it read, "Hosted with joy by Mr. and Mrs. Nathaniel Worthington III." That was it. My name was nowhere to be found. My late husband's memory was completely erased. It was as if Isabella had been immaculately conceived into the Worthington dynasty, with no messy history or complicated family background to explain away. I stared at that invitation for what felt like hours, reading it over and over again, hoping I had somehow misunderstood. But there was no misunderstanding. In one elegant piece of paper, 28 years of my life, my love, my sacrifice, and my identity had been systematically erased. I called Isabella immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. I tried to keep my voice light and casual, assuming this had to be some kind of mistake, some oversight that could be easily corrected. "Isabella, sweetheart, I just received the wedding invitation. It's absolutely gorgeous. The calligraphy is stunning. But I think there might be a small error. It seems like my name was accidentally left off." There was a pause, a silence that stretched just long enough for me to understand that this wasn't an accident. When she finally spoke, her voice had that carefully modulated tone she had developed over the past 2 years. The voice of someone who had been coached on how to deliver difficult news with maximum diplomatic impact. "Oh, Mom, about that. Mrs. Worthington and I had several consultations with Priscilla Whitmore. She's the etiquette expert who handles all the major society weddings, and we discussed the name situation extensively." The name situation. 28 years of my life had become a situation that required expert consultation. "The thing is," Isabella continued, her voice gaining confidence as she delivered what was clearly a carefully rehearsed explanation, "because you kept your maiden name for professional reasons, and my last name is Hayes from Dad, and obviously the Worthingtons are the Worthingtons. It created this very complicated situation with 3 different family names associated with the bride. Priscilla and Mrs. Worthington both felt that from an aesthetic and etiquette standpoint, it would be much cleaner and more elegant to simply list the host family. We wanted it simple, just his family listed. It's not personal, Mom. It's about maintaining proper form and presentation. It wasn't personal. The erasure of my entire existence wasn't personal. It was about presentation." I felt something inside me go very, very cold. It was like watching the last light go out in a house you had loved, leaving you standing in complete darkness. My daughter, the child I had given everything to, the child I had built my entire life around, had just explained to me that my love, my sacrifice, my very existence was a branding problem that needed to be solved through strategic omission. "I see," I said, and my voice sounded strange even to my own ears, perfectly calm, perfectly controlled, perfectly empty. "Well, if simplicity and proper presentation are the priorities, then we absolutely must respect those standards. Thank you for explaining the reasoning. It's very clear now." I ended the call without saying goodbye. For the next hour, I sat in my office, staring out at the city skyline that I had helped shape, building by building, project by project. I had spent my entire adult life creating structures that would last, that would stand strong against whatever storms might come. But I had failed to build the one thing that mattered most, a relationship with my daughter that could withstand the pressure of her new world. Over the following weeks, I played my assigned role perfectly. I was the gracious, understanding mother who had accepted her diminished status with dignity. I wrote the checks when requested, attended the bridal events when invited, and smiled appropriately at all the right moments. Isabella interpreted my compliance as acceptance, my silence as agreement. She believed that I had finally understood and embraced my new position in her carefully curated life. She had no idea that I wasn't accepting anything. I was simply recognizing the new rules she had established and preparing to play by them completely. The final weeks before the wedding were a blur of increasingly frantic activity for the bridal party. Dress fittings, final venue walkthroughs, coordination meetings with vendors, and endless consultations about every microscopic detail. For me, it was a period of quiet, methodical preparation in my office. I spent those weeks reviewing contracts, making phone calls, and putting the final pieces of my plan into place. The most important call was to Celeste Dubois herself. I didn't need to explain the entire situation. As someone who had worked with wealthy families for decades, she understood the dynamics immediately. When I showed her the wedding invitation with its conspicuous omissions, her expression darkened. "A work of art," she said in her slight French accent, "should never be displayed in a place where the artist is not welcome. My contract is with you, Catherine. My loyalty is with you, and my cake will go where you decide it belongs." The call came at exactly 4:47 p.m. on the Friday before the Saturday wedding. I was in my office, reviewing the final blueprints for a new museum project, when my phone buzzed with Isabella's name. I let it ring 4 times before answering, not because I was busy, but because I wanted to savor these last few moments before everything changed forever. I didn't say hello. I simply answered and waited. MOM. The voice that came through the phone was barely recognizable as my daughter's. Gone was the carefully modulated Worthington accent she had cultivated. This was pure, raw panic, the voice of a child whose perfect world was suddenly, catastrophically falling apart. "Where are you? What have you done?" "The wedding coordinator just called from Celeste Bakery, and they won't release the cake. They're saying the final payment hasn't been authorized and that only the person who signed the contract can approve the pickup. They're saying that person is you." I leaned back in my chair, turning to face the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Somewhere out there, in a climate-controlled bakery, sat 7 tiers of architectural perfection crafted from sugar, butter, and artistic genius. A cake that had taken weeks to create, that represented the pinnacle of culinary artistry, that was supposed to be the crowning jewel of Isabella's perfect wedding. "Well," I said, my voice perfectly calm, perfectly reasonable, "that does sound like quite a predicament." "What do you mean, a predicament?" Isabella's voice cracked with hysteria. "This is a disaster. The wedding is tomorrow. There are 300 guests coming. Mrs. Worthington is already on her way to the bakery. You have to call them right now. You have to release the cake. You paid the deposit." I swiveled my chair to face the window completely, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cityscape. Somewhere out there, the Worthington estate was probably buzzing with final preparations. Flowers being arranged, tables being set, a small army of staff preparing for what was supposed to be the social event of the season. "Ah, but Isabella," I said, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a smile touch my lips. "That's where the situation becomes a bit complicated. You see, that cake was commissioned as a gift from your family, your father's memory and myself, to celebrate your marriage. But according to your wedding invitation, you don't have any family on your side of this union. The invitation makes it very clear that this wedding is being hosted by the Worthington family, with no mention of any other family involvement." I paused, letting the implications of my words settle in. "So it would be incredibly awkward and inappropriate for a gift from a non-existent family to suddenly appear at your elegant, simple wedding. It would completely contradict the careful presentation you and Mrs. Worthington worked so hard to achieve. It would be—" "What was the word you used?" "Oh yes, it would be messy." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could practically hear the gears of her mind grinding as she tried to process the inescapable logic of what I had just said. She was trapped in the very box she had built, imprisoned by the rules she had insisted on enforcing. What are you talking about?" she finally stammered. "That was just for the invitation. It wasn't real. You're still my mother. You can't do this to me." "But it is real, Isabella," I replied, my voice still perfectly calm. "You made it real when you decided that my existence was too complicated for your new life. You made it real when you chose to erase your father's memory because it didn't fit your narrative. You made it real when you publicly declared who you considered to be your family, and that declaration did not include me." I could hear other voices in the background now, sharp, imperious tones that could only belong to Mrs. Worthington herself. She had arrived at the bakery and was presumably discovering that all her money, all her influence, all her social connections were utterly powerless against the simple fact that she had no legal right to claim a cake that belonged to someone else. "This is insane." Isabella's voice dropped to a desperate whisper. "Mom, please. Mrs. Worthington is here. She's furious. The entire wedding party is in panic mode. You're destroying everything. How could you do this to me?" And there it was, the question I had been waiting for. the moment when everything crystallized into perfect clarity. "How could I do this to you?" I repeated, and for the first time, steel entered my voice. "Isabella, I am not doing anything to you. I am simply respecting the boundaries you established. You wanted a wedding that reflected only the Worthington family values, traditions, and connections. You wanted to present yourself as someone who emerged fully formed into their world, with no messy history or complicated relationships to explain away." I stood up from my chair, looking out at the city where I had built my career, where I had raised my daughter, where I had created a life of meaning and purpose. "You have exactly what you asked for, a simple, elegant wedding hosted entirely by the Worthington family, with no interference from anyone who might complicate your narrative. The cake I commissioned was a gift from a family you've chosen to pretend doesn't exist. Since that family is not part of your wedding, neither is its gift." I could hear Isabella crying now, the kind of desperate sobbing that comes from realizing that actions have consequences, that words have power, that some damage cannot be undone. "But I need you," she whispered. "I need the cake. I need my mother." "No, sweetheart," I said, and my voice was gentle now, filled with the sadness of a love that had been betrayed and discarded. "You need a checkbook. You need someone to fund your ascension into a world that requires you to be ashamed of where you came from. And I am no longer willing to play that role." I hung up the phone. The aftermath, as I learned later from a cousin who was working as a photographer at the event, was a spectacular display of Worthington fury and panic. Mrs. Worthington, a woman accustomed to having every door opened and every problem solved through the application of money and influence, discovered that true artistry cannot be bought, borrowed, or bullied. Celeste Dubois was absolutely immovable. When Mrs. Worthington demanded to speak to the owner, Celeste informed her that she was the owner. When Mrs. Worthington threatened legal action, Celeste calmly produced the contract showing that she had no legal obligation to anyone except Catherine Miller. When Mrs. Worthington offered to double the remaining payment, Celeste explained that her integrity was not for sale at any price. The frantic search for a replacement cake on the day before a major society wedding was doomed from the start. The best they could manage was a generic, mass-produced sheet cake from an upscale grocery store, the kind of cake that might be appropriate for an office birthday party, but was laughably inadequate for what was supposed to be the wedding of the year. The empty cake stand in the center of the grand ballroom became the focal point of the entire reception. Instead of Celeste's seven-tier masterpiece, a cake that would have been photographed, admired, and talked about for years, there sat a sad, lonely sheet cake that looked like an afterthought, a placeholder, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. But the real masterpiece wasn't the missing cake. It was watching Isabella's carefully constructed facade crumble as she realized that her perfect plan had backfired in the most public way possible. She had wanted to demonstrate her successful integration into high society. Instead, she had created a scandal that would be whispered about in those same social circles for decades. The missing cake became legendary, not because of its beauty, but because of its absence. Not because of its taste, but because of the story behind its disappearance. Isabella had wanted to make a statement about who she was becoming. Instead, she had made a statement about who she truly was, someone willing to sacrifice the people who loved her most for social advancement. 3 months after the wedding, Isabella called me. Not to apologize, but to ask if I would consider contributing to the down payment on the Hamptons house she and Nathaniel were hoping to buy. She seemed genuinely surprised when I politely declined. She got her simple wedding, free from any complicated family dynamics or messy emotional attachments. She got her perfect integration into Worthington society, purchased at the cost of her own history and identity. She got everything she thought she wanted. But she didn't get the cake. And more importantly, she didn't get her mother back. Because sometimes, when someone shows you who they really are, the most loving thing you can do is believe them.